All right, I think I'm live. So if at any point it sounds like the audio sounds bad or if the video cuts out, just let me know in the comments. Anyway, this one's going to be pretty short. I just had an idea and I kind of wanted to see if it worked. And, any work that I put in on this Tetris thing, I'm going to go ahead and do live. So just figured I'd go ahead and start the live stream up. So let's take a look, and I'm going to mentally go through what I did in the last one, and then I'm going to kind of say what I think is going wrong with it. And then I'm going to do a couple of things just to kind of see if it will work. I had an idea, and I'll explain that in a moment. But just a reminder, this is not a tutorial. This is just me coding Tetris in vanilla JavaScript to see if I could do it without any prior experience in doing so. So it's kind of just like an experiment, just a coding session. I'll be thinking out loud and kind of doing this, and you can kind of watch me do it if you want. Ask me questions, give me suggestions. Feel free to do that. All right, so with that being said, the first thing I do is let's start in the HTML. I've just got a basic HTML document here. I've got a div with a grid, and I'm loading the JavaScript here. And then inside the JavaScript file, I add an event listener on the document that is DOM content loaded, and when that loads, I just run this function. Now currently, it's just a set interval, which is basically my game loop, as I'm calling it. And it runs every 200 milliseconds, which is just for debugging purposes because it allows it to run really quickly. If I save it, you can kind of see it goes really quick, so I don't have to wait 5 years for it to get to the next iteration. So if the current piece.id, what that's saying is if there is a current piece, if the current piece object has an ID property and it's not null or undefined or anything like that, then we go ahead and call move piece with down. Else, we set the current piece equal to a brand new piece that we generate, and then we give it an ID of a UUID function that I found on the interwebs. And then we call put piece on grid, and then either way, if or else, we call draw grid afterwards. And those functions are as such. Okay, so here we're kind of hard coding this like two-dimensional array to represent the data of the grid, and then we're basically looping through that inside of draw grid and injecting divs inside of divs to create the grid that you see here, giving it classes, etc. So the problem that I ran into in the last one was if I refresh, I can demonstrate this. You can see it gets close to the bottom and then it just breaks. And I think the reason why is because I wasn't doing my calculation correctly. Inside of this move piece function, and also I'll show you what I think is going on. Let's see if this can fix it. So I was doing less than grid.length -1. I shouldn't be doing the -1 here or here. And then if we get to this point right here, I need to return. Like, we shouldn't run this loop anymore. So I'm going to save it and see what happens. Okay, so it still flattens, which is not good. We don't want it to flatten. So why is it flattening? That is probably because I need to do that. Let's see if that fixes it. Nice. Okay, so you can see it like sets the piece in the proper spot here at the bottom, and then it resets with a new piece. It would be nice if the piece stayed, but we'll get to that shortly. So my idea, the thing that I wanted to kind of talk about, which actually I'm going to put this on like a ridiculous number so that it's not distracting me on the side. The idea that I had was to kind of take a more functional approach to this. So right now I have this global grid object, or it's a two-dimensional array. And I'm mutating this object whenever I want to move a piece or whenever I want to do anything. Like even if I were to rotate a piece or anything, I'm basically going into this grid, looping through it, and then changing the pieces here. Like I'm mutating it, and I don't want to do that. And I was thinking, what if I could just create a blueprint for the grid, like a blueprint, and then whenever, let's say whenever I need to access the grid, I can just go into the DOM, like document.getElementById or getElementsByClassName, loop through the DOM itself, and generate this object from the DOM on the fly. So whenever I need to access the grid, I can just build the grid from the DOM. And then I can create a blueprint that basically initializes the DOM grid at the beginning of the app, if that kind of makes sense. If not, that's fine. I'll kind of implement it in a second. And basically that's what this live stream is going to be about, seeing whether or not this works correctly. But in doing so, I realized maybe I want to, whenever I have a function that changes the grid in some way, whether it's moving a piece or setting a piece or generating a new piece, whenever there's some sort of function that changes the grid, it should return a new grid. And so at the beginning of that, it needs to create a brand new grid from the DOM, edit that brand new grid, and then return that grid. And then instead of having this global grid here, just do it that way. It's like, it's more functional. And hopefully that will help me in the long run. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of some extra spaces and stuff. I'm thinking in my head like, okay, the first thing I need to do is to create this grid here without manually drawing the grid out. I'll show you what I mean by that. So I need to create this grid without just like manually writing this two-dimensional array. And I can do that by using a for loop. So I can just basically say let grid, and I'm going to comment this out for now. Let grid equal a function, or we'll call it a grid blueprint. And it's going to be a for loop, and I can't remember, what are the dimensions here? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So it's 10 by 22, and I'm just going to make sure that I remember that. Grid is 10 by 22. And so what I need to do is basically loop through this. But yeah, let's do a nested for loop. Whoops. And let's say let I equal 0. I is less than 22. I plus plus. And then in here we'll do j. Let j equal 0. J is less than 10. And then j plus plus. Okay. And then I'm going to basically up here say let new grid, or let's just say let grid equal an empty array perhaps. And then I will, for each, okay, so at the bottom here nice. So I'll say let row equal an empty array. And then at the end of this for loop, I will just say grid dot push row. And then I'm going to do the same thing in here kind of. We'll create, at the end of this for loop, we're going to say row dot push unit, and which means I need to create a unit. So let's say this is what a unit is going to be. It's just going to be an empty object. So we need to row dot push an empty object, right? And then at the end of this, I'm going to just console.log what the grid looks like. And I have to call this grid blueprint. Save. Okay. Let's see if this looks like what I think it does. Array of 10 empty objects. Yep. Cool. Perfect. So obviously we're going to be getting errors right now because I've got the main grid commented out, but this function creates this object now. So I don't think I need to any longer use this. So with that being said, let's just utilize this. Let's say grid blueprint. When we first open up the app here, and inside of here, what we need to do is inside of draw grid, we need a function that says initialize grid, don't we? Const init grid. And this is going to be a function that basically does exactly what draw grid does, but instead of checking for classes and that sort of thing, we're just going to generate the grid on the DOM. So wherever I check for I mean, I got to give it that class, but we don't need to check here. So, yep, that looks good. And then instead of saying that, well, we have to have a const grid equals grid blueprint. All right, let me just make sure that this is working as expected. Okay, that didn't. Says 164. We have an error. And it says cannot read property for each of undefined. So this is saying, okay, so I must not be returning the grid. Simple enough. Return grid. Save. And now we're generating the grid dynamically. Although now we're getting grid.map is not a function, and I expected to get errors because of the way this is kind of a massive change, so I expected to get some errors at the very least. This is saying grid.map is not a function, line 111. Yeah, so basically now it's trying to access grid. So now whenever we do any sort of function that changes the grid in some way, which put piece on grid would change the grid in some way, instead of manipulating that global grid object, instead we're going to be taking the grid from the DOM and then returning a brand new grid. So what I need to do is say const grid equals, and then some function that goes into the DOM and creates an object based off of the grid inside of the DOM. So it's going to break a few times until I get this working, but the very first thing I need to do is get that function. So I need to create a function called getGrid from DOM. And all it's going to do is go into the DOM, and then it's going to end up returning an object that looks like this, but based off of what we see in the actual game. So let's look here. The ID is grid. So we're going to start by saying const main grid div is equal to document.getElementById grid. Now we know that when we're drawing the grid, when we first initialize the grid, we are throwing in nested divs here, and essentially we have a top level grid div, and then inside of that we have rows, so divs with the class name row, and then inside of that we have units with the class name unit, grid unit and grid row. So what I need to do is just translate that over to here, to this sort of logic, but using a for loop. So let's say const rows, or let's say main grid rows, or just grid rows. Is equal to document.getElementsByClassName. Get elements by class name. In fact, I might not even need this, so I'm just going to comment it out for now. I might. We'll see how this works. Okay, get elements by class name, grid row. Okay, so I'm going to log that. And the first thing I'm going to do inside of put piece on grid is call that function. Well, actually, I'll just console.log. No, I'll call this function because I'm already logging inside of it. Whoops. Let's see what happens. Cool. So it gives me all of the rows. There are 21 rows. No, there's 22. Yeah, because it starts with 0. Perfect. So we know we're getting all the rows. And then now I want to translate that over into where each row. So we need to loop through the children. We need to get the children. Is there a children? Can we do that? Does that work? I didn't think so. I need to, let's see, get rows DOM. Let's see what properties it has. Whoa. There we go. These are all the properties of these items. Inner HTML. So that's interesting. We could access the inner HTML. Child nodes. So, okay, perfect. So child nodes is going to be each individual unit inside of that particular row. So that is perfect. So I'm going to start here with like a const grid is equal to an empty array. And I'm going to start looping through this grids row DOM. So grids row DOM dot for each. I'm going to say for each row. Now we're looping through each row. We can say const units is equal to row dot, what was it, child nodes. So now we have access to the units, which is going to be a node list of each unit. So I'm going to convert that to an array by saying array.from. That way I can use for each on it. And I think I need to do the same thing here. Yep. That way I can do array functions on it. Now I'm going to say units.forEach. I'm going to say for each unit. Now we're looping through the units. I'm going to console.log each unit and just make sure that this loop is making sense here. Okay, perfect. So now I'm looping through each unit. Perfect. Now I can kind of do the same thing that I'm doing here, but inside of this function. Also, sorry, I'm kind of multitasking. I'm looking at the live stream and I'm coding and doing a bunch of things at once, so it's hard to portray my thought process, but I'm doing my best here. All right, so units.forEach. So what I want to do is inside of this loop, probably, yeah, right here's fine. Const row, not row, we'll just call it like row, man, I don't know, row data. And then in here we'll do row const unit data. We might not need that. All right, so row data, and then we're gonna push that. We're gonna say for each unit we want to push row data. So row data dot push. Let's do an empty object. And then at the end of this right here, we want to say grid dot push row. Save. Oh, I should probably log the row. I'm in the grid, console.log grid, save. Okay. Now the row, I'm trying to push row data, not row. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, perfect. So now we're doing the same thing, but now we have, this is why it's different. Okay, so now let's just say the grid has, which you can't see it now because I broke it, but let's just say on the grid there is a piece that's red. Well, inside of here I can check for class names and build the grid based on what the grid looks like. So in other words, I can go into the DOM, generate the grid as a two-dimensional array, and then use that on the fly within the program, which is going to be, I think, very helpful for me in the future when we start adding the actual features of the game instead of manipulating this global object here. Cool. So now that I have access to that, I need to return it. And just remember, this isn't the final function here. This is just basically to prove this out in my head that this works. So now, what was this called? Get grid from DOM. I'm calling it, but what I need to say is const grid is equal to get grid from DOM. And then instead of doing it like that, we need to then return grid. So now we're getting the grid from the DOM, we're editing that object, and then we're returning we're returning that. So every single time we call put piece on grid, it's editing a brand new object that we create on the fly based from the DOM instead of that global one. So now let's see where we call put piece on grid. We call it here. So now we know that this returns a grid. So that means we're going to need to call draw grid with the piece that, with the grid that this returns. So let's say draw grid like that. We know that put piece on grid returns a grid with a new item inside of it, and draw grid now needs to accept a grid. I wonder if this will just work. Assignment to constant variable 101. Yeah, I get that. Gotcha. So the logic is slightly different. So let's see what it is I need to do here. So return row.map, blah, 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 current piece, or an empty object, return the grid in the end. So instead of mapping through it, what I really need to be doing is interesting. I mean, I could just potentially do that. Okay. So now it appears there. That's good. I'm going to have to revisit this, but for now, this is fine. So now we need to do the exact same thing I did here with move piece. So move piece, again, every time there's some sort of function that does something to a piece, or I mean does something to the grid, I need to return a new grid and also pass. Yeah. Yes. Yes. So let's see. Let's call draw grid with this function. So this is very much functional programming that I'm doing here. Kind of. I'm not going to say it's perfect functional programming, because put piece on grid and all of these other functions are going to contain side effect functions. So I'll probably have to come back and clean this code up later. But let's see about getting this working. So move piece down needs to now return instead of just returning null here, I need to return the new grid, which means I need to do the same thing I do here, which is, where's put piece on grid? I need to do this. And then I need to return the grid. And then, yeah, I don't know. Let's see what happens. And it broke. Okay, so 138. We're calling draw grid. Says for each of undefined, so grid is undefined here. Which means that for some reason I'm returning undefined from move piece down. Which means I want to log that and see what's going on here. At what point is it undefined? It's undefined instantly. So let's find out why that is. So let's log here. Let's log the grid. Is this good? So that's fine. So we begin the for loop, and then the nested for loop, and then we're doing some editing of some stuff, and then we're returning the grid here. So let's see what the value of grid is at the beginning of each loop, which means it's going to log a ton of grids. Yeah. So right before it breaks, the value of the grid, let's make this a little bigger, doesn't seem to contain what I would expect, which is fine because the grid, I haven't done any logic yet on, speaking of that, okay, so I haven't done any logic on basically like actually making these not empty objects, and that is fine, but let's see, where is this breaking? Let I equal grid.length. Well, we're getting here. If grid ij.id, are we at least getting this far? This is how I debug, by the way. This is probably not the best way, but basically I need to figure out where, like how far am I getting before it finally breaks? Okay, we're not getting into this for loop. Makes me wonder, are we getting here too early? Here too early. Okay, so probably what's happening is it's neither, right? So let's say console.log, neither. That is not that is not how you spell that. Okay, cool. So confirmed. So that means this logic doesn't make sense right now. Of course it doesn't make sense right now because how could it possibly have an ID? Right? So where am I setting the ID? That is happening when I generate a new piece. So when I am inside of, where is that function? Put piece on grid, the grid that's being returned should have pieces with an ID in it. Man. But for some reason it doesn't. Okay, it does. It definitely does. So, gotcha. All right. This is probably pretty obvious to those who are watching, maybe. It's a little harder when you're doing stuff live on YouTube. But basically, there is a mismatch between what I'm returning here. So when I call draw grid with the, not that one. When I call draw grid with put piece on grid, there's a mismatch because I basically have to go in there now and set the IDs. So when I go to get grid from DOM, I actually have to set those IDs now. Now, in order to set the IDs in data, I need to actually set the IDs in the DOM because basically I'm building this data grid from the DOM. So anything that I build and put inside of this this data object has to be in the DOM. So what that means is I'm probably going to have to add data attributes or maybe even an ID or something like that with the actual UUID that I'm using here to say that the particular piece, the particular div element in the HTML document is or has this particular UUID. So when I draw the grid, right here, if unit.type, what that's saying is if unit.type, if that's true, then we know we're on like a piece. And so I'm adding a class list, or I'm appending to the class list the unit.type. In other words, is it an L? Is it a J? You know, whatever type of piece it is, whatever shape it is. Here is where I also need to give it a data attribute. So let's see, how can I do this? Unit L dot, I want to say it's like data set. I can't remember how to do this. I think it's data set dot, it might be dictionary, or is it underscore, or how does this work? Here, let's Google that. JavaScript data set add. Set attribute would be probably the best way to do it. So unit L dot set attribute. And then it is the data attribute and the interesting. So I can just say ID colon and then give it the UUID that I generated. Or I guess I'll have to generate it here, it looks like. Or no, because I actually have access to it. Sweet. So instead, I'll interpolate. And let's do this. ID colon. And then I need to access the unit ID. And I'm looping through, I have it right here, so it's probably unit.id, right? And just to make sure this is making sense, I'm gonna actually log the unit here. And let's see what happens when I save it. Still gonna break. Okay, it is ID, perfect. So now I have now I'm setting the ID attribute. Let me console.log the unit element and make sure that that looks right. Yep. Okay, so now it has data ID colon, but that's not quite exactly what I was expecting when looking at this. I see. Okay, so really the way that they are saying to do it is unitl.dataset.id is equal to, and then just grab this guy right here. Let's try it that way. Save it. Log it. That's what I want. Data ID. Perfect. Cool. So now I have it in the DOM. So now that I have it in the DOM, when I build the grid from the DOM, I can grab that ID, and instead of just pushing an empty object, I can say if unit.type, or if unit.dataset.id, I want to say that, let's console.log unit.dataset.id. Okay, right there. Perfect. So if that, we want to push something else other than an empty object. Otherwise, you can have the empty object. So the ID here would be unit.dataset.id. Now there's other stuff too, like type. Now the type would be unit.classList. So let me, while I'm in here, I'm gonna actually like log. Let's return just this for now. But I wanna log the unit and see what the class list looks like, because I'm pretty sure I can use the class list to so grid unit L. Okay. So it looks like I can probably set the type. Let's see if I go up. It's just a letter, right? So I can just say type equals unit.classList class unit.classList.length -1, and then that should, let's see what happens. Getting close, guys. So here's the row data, ID, and type L. So this is what I would expect, I believe. But it looks like, okay, so if I go to 150 for each, so grid is undefined because we're not passing it in, I think, anymore. Or are we? So console.log new grid. So move piece down 187. That's still undefined. So that means new grid is undefined. Where is the function I'm looking for? Right here. Okay. So neither is still getting called, which is fine. It checks on the ID. So what I need to do is quickly console.log the grid, make sure that it is getting what I would expect in there. It's going to be logged on 127 right here. And all right, cool. So here we have an actual representation of the grid, I believe. Let me refresh it one more time and just make sure. So there's that. And then when it tries to move, yep, that's correct. Now, here's the ID, and here's the type. And now we're saying if that item has an ID and I+1, blah, blah, blah. So why are we getting to neither? That's what I need to figure out now. Because grid has a length, so this is so manual. This is why I hate writing code like this. But this is very experimental right now. Grid.length is, let's see, 127, we'll say the number 22. So it definitely has a length. It should be looping through fine. And then when we get here, this should be happening. It is indeed happening. Perfect. So now the question is, why aren't we returning grid? So now I'm going to move that happening statement here. See if we get here. And obviously we're not, right? Correct. So what's happening? Okay. So now what's happening? Got it. So when we move down, okay, cool. So now we're not getting an error, but let's take a look at what this looks like. So these are all the same. That figures. We're not getting the error, but what's happening is we need to return. I'm afraid to return it here because I don't think that, obviously that's not what I want to do. Instead, I think I want to return here. So that break statement is pointless now. There we go. That's nice. That is nice. Okay. So I got it working. So what does that mean? Basically what it means is now I don't have to rely on a global grid object that I had defined up here that is no longer there. I don't have to rely on that freaking giant grid object that I'm just mutating over and over again. And, you know, Lord only knows what's going to happen over the span of time after mutating that 100 times. JavaScript is not the best language for mutating objects. So I'm going to take a functional approach the rest of this tutorial. And basically, anytime I have a function where I'm going to change the grid in any way, I'm going to return a new grid. And whenever I need to access the grid, I'm going to grab it from the DOM on the fly instead of some global object. So hope that makes sense, but I'll talk to you guys later.